Okay, I think we can get started. We're just a couple of minutes after 1 o'clock Eastern time. So good afternoon, or good evening, or good morning, depending on your time zone. And welcome to today's Providence College Jewish-Catholic Theological Exchange Dialogue. I'm Arthur Urbano, Professor of Theology and Chair of the Jewish-Catholic Theological Exchange Committee. I'm here with my colleague Benny Bar-Levi, who is here at PC as the inaugural scholar in residence in Jewish Studies and Jewish Christian Relations, an initiative that we launched just last year. And maybe some of you were signed on last summer for Benny's talk. The JCTE was established in 2007 to develop programming that promotes Christian-Jewish engagement, especially in the areas of theology and biblical studies. And since 2009, we have sponsored lectures, colloquia, small group discussions, and other events to further our mission to foster interreligious learning, understanding, and friendship. The work of the JCTE fits into a larger history of Jewish Catholic engagement at Providence College that extends all the way back to the 1930s. And if you'd like to learn more about the JCTE or see recordings of previous events, you can visit our webpage at jewish-catholic.providence.edu, and I'll put that link in the chat a little bit later. So we're here today to talk about Rabbi Eugene Korn's latest book, Israel and the Nations, the Bible, the Rabbis, and Jewish-Gentile Relations, published last year by Academic Studies Press. We're honored to be joined by Rabbi Korn today, who incidentally was one of our very first speakers in this series back in 2010. So we're really glad to have him join us again today. Rabbi Korn holds a doctorate in moral philosophy from Columbia University and was ordained in Israel as an Orthodox rabbi. He has taught at Columbia, Yeshiva, and Seton Hall universities and is the former academic director of the Center for Jewish-Christian Understanding, executive director of the Center for Christian-Jewish Understanding, and national director of interfaith affairs at the Anti-Defamation League. He has published a number of books and essays on Jewish thought and Jewish-Christian relations, and Rabbi Korn is joining us today from his home in Jerusalem. Also joining us today is Dr. Mary Boyes, Skinner and McAlpin Professor of Practical Theology at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. She has served as visiting lecturer of religious education at Princeton Theological Seminary, Claremont School of Theology, John Carroll University, Villanova University, and St. Mary's College in London. She's been a Lilly Research Fellow and a Henry Luce Fellow in Theology. In addition, she's a member of the Committee on Religion, Ethics, and the Holocaust at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and the National Catholic Center for Holocaust Education at Seton Hall University. Formerly, she served on the Advisory Committee for the Secretariat of Ecumenical and Interreligious Affairs of the United States Catholic Bishops. She has authored 6 books and about 100 articles in the areas of theology and Jewish-Christian relations. She's also a member of the Sisters of the Holy Names of Jesus and Mary, a congregation of Roman Catholic women. So both Rabbi Korn and Dr. Boyes have made groundbreaking contributions to Jewish-Christian dialogue, and so we're really, really pleased that they're joining us today. So before we jump in, here's how the event will proceed. So first, as I said, as people were entering, please make sure that you are muted during the discussion. Also, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So if you prefer not to be seen, please feel free to turn off your cameras. So Rabbi Korn will begin with an overview of some major points of the book. Then Professor Boyes will offer a response. At that point, we'll take a short break and then return for discussion and Q&A. If you have a question, there are 2 ways to pose them. First, you can either click the raised hand feature, which will put you in a queue to ask a question live. We'll call on you individually to ask your question. or alternatively, you can type your question into the chat feature at any time, and in the Q&A session, we'll present them to our speakers. And in order to give as many people as possible an opportunity to ask questions, please kindly keep your questions brief, on topic, and as they say in Jeopardy, in the form of a question. And so we're planning to go no later than 90 minutes, and that's sort of the outline for today. Lastly, if you're interested in purchasing Rabbi Korn's book, I'll put a link to it in the chat. For members of the PC community, we do have the book available as an ebook through the Phillips Memorial Library, so you can access it that way. So without further ado, I'm happy to hand over the floor to Rabbi Korn, who will get us started. Rabbi Korn.
Thank you, Arthur. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. I see so many friends on the broadcast and in the chat room. And I'd like to thank Arthur and Benny for putting this together. It's great to be back at Providence College, even if it's only through a computer. And it's also wonderful to be with Mary, Sister Boys, once again. We're old-time travelers in Jewish-Catholic relations when we were in New York. When I was in New York, Mary's still in New York. So it's really a pleasure to be here and to discuss some ideas that I covered in the book and hopefully have a productive discussion. The book, basically, what I tried to do in the book was to carve out traditional Jewish theological and legal categories in light of Jewish history and Jewish Christian history, and also modern experiences. And I tried to carve out these categories and see where they could take us, particularly in light of post-Vatican II changes in Christian teachings about Judaism and the Jewish people. So let me give you just a real brief overview of what the book covers. I'll do it very briefly as it says in the Talmud, and Jews are wont to say, standing on one foot. Let's start at the beginning. The beginning is the biblical beginning, is the birth of the Jewish people that occurs in chapter 12 of Genesis, where God makes a covenant with Abraham and his descendants. And he tells Abraham that he and his descendants should be a blessing. And then in the Hebrew, which is that through you and your descendants, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. So that means that Abraham and his descendants have a universal mission, which is, when you think about it, it's critical. Because God is the creator of heaven and earth. God created all humanity. And yet, in the Bible, at least in the Jewish scriptures, it starts out a universal cosmic story, chapters 1 through 11. And then the dramatic literary shift takes place, beginning with chapter 12 through the end of Jewish scriptures and Chronicles. It's basically a story about the Jewish people. So what's happened here? You know, has God gone ethnic in a sense? Where is his concern for all of humanity? And the answer is, the concern is in the Jewish mission, he has tasked the Jewish people, or the descendants of Abraham, to have a universal influence and to teach the world about God and divine moral values. Jews are not destined to be a ghetto people. And they have to influence humanity toward moral and religious and theological progress. Now, that sounds very nice, but that's difficult to do historically, particularly in the midst of persecution and enemies around us. How do you do that when the people around you are persecuting you? That's one of the great problems of Jewish history, Jewish sacred history. So first, the rabbis understood that God has to have a relationship with all of humanity. So in fact, in terms of covenantal, Jewish covenantal theology, there are three major covenants that the Bible lays out. The first is the covenant with Noah. That is the covenant with all of humanity. After the flood that occurs early in Genesis, God makes a covenant with Noah and his descendants. That is all humanity. And that's a universal covenant. Then there's the covenant with Abraham, which appears to be with Abraham and his biological descendants, i.e. the Jewish people. And then in Exodus, there's a covenant at Sinai with Moses and the children of Israel. So there's these three covenants. And these are all very critical within the context of rabbinic thought, of Jewish theology. And what it says here is that there's an implication of a limited theological pluralism. That is, Jews can relate to God legitimately through the covenant of Abraham and the covenant of Moses. And all of humanity can relate and should relate to God through the covenant of Noah, right? And God relates to them through the covenant of Noah. So there's a kind of limited theological pluralism. It's not that everything goes, but there is space. Judaism never had this concept that you had to be Jewish to be saved or to be loved by God, because all humanity is covered in the covenant of Noah. Now, this sounds very nice and pluralistic, but there is a catch here. There is a problem, because the rabbis fleshed out 7 commandments that the participants in the Noahide covenant need to obey, and they're exclusively moral or civic commandments. That is, you must not kill, you must not steal, you must be sexually disciplined, you cannot be cruel. But there is one theological requirement, and that's the prohibition against idolatry. Right? So people who are idolaters, who pray to idols, are not fulfilling the covenant of Noah. And we'll talk a little bit about what idolatry is, what it was, and whether it still is relevant today. But that's a critical aspect, and it does play very critically into how the rabbis and traditional Jews and contemporary Jews try to understand Christianity. So if we talk a little bit about what is idolatry, there are 2 conceptions of idolatry that you find in the Bible. One is the old-time conception. Idolaters are people who pray to the stars, to the sun and the moon, to sacred trees, to physical objects. In other words, it's a conceptual error. They misunderstand what God is, and they substitute something physical and finite in the world for God. And that's the ancient form of idolatry that you see listed in the Bible very frequently. But there's another conception of idolatry that you find in the Bible, and that is people who have no moral restraints. That is, people whose religion or whose beliefs don't impose any kind of moral restraints upon them. They're wild, pagan, uncivilized human beings. I mean, the prototype for idolatry in the Bible is the idol of Moloch. And the followers of Moloch used to engage in human sacrifice. They used to sacrifice their children to Moloch. So this is a second conception of idolatry. It's not cognitive error or theological error as much as it is immorality or a lack of any kind of morality. And this kind of plays into the whole discussion about how rabbis, particularly rabbis in the Middle Ages, tried to understand Christianity, because they understood that, for the most part, Christians were moral people. At least Christianity taught morality. But they were perplexed by the idea of, by the question of whether the Christian God made the cognitive error of mistaking something that is not God for God. Because the Trinity and the Incarnation within Christian theology, are both violently opposed, not violently, but they're strongly opposed by pure Jewish monotheism. So the question then became, are Christians fulfilling the no-id commandment? Are they idolaters, not in the pagan sense of idolaters, but in the theologically incorrect sense of idolaters? How did they understand the Trinity and the Incarnation? Now, it turns out that in the Middle Ages, rabbis began to understand that Christian belief is different from other non-Jewish belief, because the Trinity includes God the Father, who is identified with what Jews call Borei Shamayim Va'aretz, that is the one creator of heaven and earth. Okay, so even if Christianity was a form of cognitive error, idolatrous cognitive error, it wasn't like old-time idolaters, because Christianity did acknowledge the creator of heaven and earth. The problem for the rabbis was that there are other things that come along with God the Father, that is God the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But there was an acknowledgement that Christianity was a sort of special form. So the question then became, was Christianity idolatry or not idolatry? Is Christianity in the no-id covenant or not in the no-id covenant? And in my book, I argue that that's no longer the serious question for traditional Jews or theologically oriented Jews, and that shouldn't govern how Jews and Christians relate to each other theologically. The real question is, can Jews see Christians as sharing the Abrahamic covenant? That is, sharing the covenant to teach humanity about the creator of heaven and earth and sacred moral values. Because it turns out that in the late Middle Ages, the rabbis kind of made peace, or many of the rabbis made peace with this notion of the Trinity, because they understood that whereas Jews were prohibited from any kind of impure monotheism, that is, any kind of association of other things with the one creator of heaven and earth, right? Gentiles are not required to do that, and therefore Christians, right, certainly are not a form of idolatry. Christianity is not a form of idolatry. So there's certainly no idols. But the truth is that the rabbis or the Jewish people never had much incentive to say that we share the covenant with Christians. And that was primarily because of the historical animosity and between the Jewish people and official Christianity, and the persecutions and the crusades and the ghettos and the horrible history that Jews had with Christianity up until modern times. So Jews were very theologically oriented Jews, or rabbis were very reluctant because of historical experience to begin to share the covenant with their personal covenant with Christians. And they were also very afraid of assimilation. Assimilation in Jewish tradition is a four-letter word, much like syncretism is for the Vatican today. Okay, meaning that Jews were always a minority, a small minority, very vulnerable to larger, powerful culture. And to get too close to Christians and Christianity would inevitably lead to a dilution of Jewish belief, and Jews, in effect, becoming Christians by virtue of their weak social and political and cultural weakness. So all of these were major factors in how Jews understood Christians and Christianity up until the advent of modernity. Now, in modernity, the notion of tolerance grew, even if it was from secular sources, but Jews and Christians began to get along on much better terms. And this alienation, because of a sense of persecution, kind of receded. And therefore, Jews began to look at Christians and Christianity much more sympathetically. And the big break really occurred, the major change really occurred at the Second Vatican Council with Nostra Aetate, when the Catholic Church said, renounced supersessionism Supersession is an ugly sounding word because it's an ugly concept. It was the old concept that Christianity had replaced Judaism, whereas God once related to the Jews as the people of Israel. After the advent of Jesus and Christianity, the church replaced the synagogue. But at the Second Vatican Council, that doctrine was, if not officially repudiated, it was unofficially repudiated. And it was, and Christian teachings, much because of the implication of Christianity in the extermination of the Jews during the Second World War, Christianity was very heavily implicated in the extermination of the Jews. So Christianity had a very, and particularly the Catholic Church, had a very serious spiritual moment of introspection and understood that the teachings had to change, or the teachings had to develop, one could say. I was at the Vatican and speaking to a very high-level cardinal, and somebody mentioned about the changes at the Second Vatican Council, and he stopped people and said, here we don't speak of change, we speak of developments. Okay, but it really was a change. It was a major change. It's called the Copernican Revolution in Christian thought. And once supersessionism was no longer the normative doctrine, Jews began to look much, even traditional Jews began to look much more sympathetically at Christianity and Christian belief and toward Christians, because the threat, the spiritual threat, was receding or had receded. So that's really much of the second half of my book. It deals not with Jewish-Gentile relations per se, but how do we apply these traditional Jewish theological and legal or halachic categories toward contemporary Christians. And I argued in the book, particularly toward the end, as I said before, that the question for Jews or traditional Jews, theologically oriented Jews, is no longer are Christians in the Noahide covenant, but are Christians covenantal partners with Jews in sharing the covenant of Abraham. In a sense, what we can say is that Christians are spiritually the descendants of Abraham, if not biologically so. And because there is no longer a threat of supersessionism or conversion to a great degree, Jews ought to be more open to this kind of covenantal partnership. And I'll close with just on a practical note. What does it mean to be covenantal partners in the covenant of Abraham? So I laid out 6 kind of practical implications of how Jews and Christians can be partners in the Abrahamic covenant. And here's what I think it means. It means teaching the world that the universe has a spiritual center. It's not just atoms bumping up against each other. It's not just physicalism, but there's a spiritual center to the universe because it was created by a great spiritual being. 2, it means that moral values are not just personal issues, they're not just subjective choices that we make, but moral values have a transcendent objective character, and therefore must be a major force in human life and in human culture. 3, it means that both Christians and Jews have to affirm what it says in the first chapter of Genesis, that all human beings are created in God's sacred image, and therefore all human beings have intrinsic dignity and must be respected. 4, it means also that there's legitimacy to both biological human diversity and even theological diversity. And this is an issue that maybe Mary and I can talk about. I'm not so sure that she agrees with me on this particular issue, but the notion of different covenants, multiple covenants, opens the door to certain legitimacy of theological pluralism and acceptance of legitimate theological diversity. As it says in the prophet Micah, chapter 4, the great vision of the Messianic time is that all people will come to Jerusalem and seek the name of the Lord, and people will call God in their own name. So not everybody is in the same synagogue or in the same church. Fifthly, that just as Abraham, argued for saving the innocent people of Sodom and Gomorrah, we as the children of Abraham also have to be people who defend life and not death. Our God is a God of life, not a God of death. And we must teach justice and righteousness as Abraham taught justice and righteousness. And finally, that if we have a messianic belief, what that translates to in practical terms is that we have to believe in human progress. We have to believe that over the centuries, human beings can improve and human culture can improve morally, and we must be major influences, in the moral improvement of humanity. So that's very, very briefly what the book is about. And just let me, before I finish, I'll just raise some issues that we might want to discuss. First of all, I talked about the Jewish understanding of Christianity in terms of a covenantal relationship. I'd like to hear from Mary or from anybody else, what's the proper way, given modern conditions and how we understand each other? How do Christians understand the covenantal relationship between Jews and Christians? Secondly, the issue of salvation or redemption is always in the background of theological discussion. As I said, Jews never taught extra synagogum nulla salus, but the church did teach extra ecclesiam nulla salus for very, very long. I think it still does. We didn't do it because we have this notion of two different paths to redemption, three different covenants. Okay. Are Jews redeemed or saved because we're invincibly ignorant? Or are there other reasons going on? Three, something I didn't mention in my overview, but I did posit in the book very briefly that there's a religious meaning to Jews returning to their ancient homeland, the biblical promised land, and that Israel can play a great cultural role in sacred history. That is to introduce diversity and pluralism into the Middle East. So what is the role of, how do Christians understand the role of the state of Israel today? Something that's a very, very controversial topic, particularly today amidst the war in Gaza. And lastly, I asked a very practical question. Can Jews and Christians really overcome their painful past and pre-Vatican II Christianity? Do we have the courage to do so? It's not easy, and it won't happen just from a proclamation. So can we really do it? Are we just dreamers? Are we just messianic idealists? And if we can do it, how do we do it in practical terms?
Thank you, Eugene, for this very stimulating book, first of all. And you listed a lot of questions to talk about here, and I'm going to try not to just do a sort of a scattershot response, but maybe to hone in on a few things. First of all, one of the things that I found so valuable in your book, and here I'm probably reading it in the context of current issues, is to realize the long history of reflection on Israel that's part of Jewish tradition. I think that there's a myth operative today that everything is sort of post-1947, 1948. But this discussion that goes way back about in which way might Israel be thought to be a blessing and a blessing to the nations and so forth. So one of the things that this leads me to is what I think might be one of the most serious errors that Christianity made from quite an early time, and I'm sort of talking here around the turn into the 2nd century, is that from a rather early time in terms of what the literary elite did, is that it didn't ask Jews, how do you understand this, but rather defined what Judaism was and put Judaism in, therefore, a very narrow category as old and obsolete, having missed the coming of the Messiah and so forth. So one of the things that I think dialogue is valuable for is for many Christians, first of all, unlearning things that we thought Judaism was or is, and being exposed to the wider world of Jewish philosophical and theological reflection, and realizing the pluralism that has always characterized the tradition, and the ways in which I think between Christians and Jews, at least in the past, the problem is less about theology and more about history, or more specifically, the consequences of the tragic history between our two peoples. So thus the necessity today for Christians to learn from Jews about what Judaism is, what Jewish communities today look like. I mean, Judaism is the abstraction, but the question is, how do Jewish communities, in the plural, understand their lives and understand how their practices incarnate, if you will, Judaism? So I think it's extremely important for Christians to acknowledge the ways in which the history, our history between Jews and Christians, is a huge blockage between our two peoples, and the way in which our simplistic understandings of Judaism block more contextualized, more accurate, and deeper, more profound perspectives on Judaism. Now, about the covenantal relationship, which runs as a thematic through your book. So in the early chapters, as I'm reading about the reflections about how the rabbis came to understand that, in a sense, the legitimacy of Christianity, it's not a word you use, but the legitimacy of Christianity can be seen through the lens of the Noahide commandments. Now, this is not unfamiliar to me, but it's just not a category in which I think Christians think about themselves. I'm not sure if you went to many churches where there are fairly literate people theologically and historically, they would really even have an understanding of what the Noahide commandments are. I could be wrong in this, but I think it's something. And so I understand the logic by which you're working. And also, when we get to chapter 9 in your book, you note that this is no longer an acceptable thesis for Jewish theology, but it's not a matter that's easily settled because, you know, for one thing, one of the reasons you're saying that the Noahide covenant is inadequate to understand Christianity is that, in fact, our two traditions are closer than any other tradition is to Judaism. So one of the puzzles, so I'm saying, all right, well, what I say to Eugene about the covenant? And one of the things that struck me as something that's not in your book, and I don't want to be like one of those reviewers who says, well, here's the book I'd really write if I were the author, because first of all, I'm not a Jew, so I couldn't write the book that you're writing. But one of the things that seems to me is a huge missing element is that it seems to me for many Christians, if you say the word covenant, which probably isn't one that's so much at the top of our list, it's that we think of the covenant through Jesus. Now, this doesn't really fit categories here. But for me, the classic text of this, usually the text that's used is from the so-called institution narrative in the synoptic gospels of Jesus saying, "This is my body, this is my blood given to you in the new covenant." In fact, of the three accounts of the institution in the gospels, in Mark, Matthew, and Luke, it's only Luke who uses the adjective new in front of covenant. And so in the notes to the New Revised Standard Version, when it comes to the version in Mark and Matthew, which simply reads, "This is my blood of the covenant," there's a little indication that says other ancient authorities add new. So I don't think we could make too much rest upon new from the saying in Luke. And of course, we don't have the ipsissimo verba in the New Testament of what Jesus, all the reflections are not, they're not transcripts, they're highly interpreted by the time the Gospels are written. But the classic text to me is in the passage in Mark 12. It has parallels in Matthew and Luke with some variation, where a scribe comes to Jesus and asking, "What is the greatest commandment of all?" And here, Hillel-like, Jesus answers, the first is, quoting Deuteronomy 6:4-5, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, with all your mind and all your strength." The second is, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." And then he concludes, "There is no other commandment greater than these." Well, this sounds to me more than the Abrahamic covenant. So I understand, I think, partly from previous conversations you and I have had, very informal ones, the reluctance to sort of, put us in the picture with not only with the Abrahamic covenant, but of course, particularly with the Sinai covenant. But what happens if you begin to realize that this saying in Mark doesn't come from a Christian trying to edge in, but from Jesus the Jew from Nazareth? And I think given the body of scholarship that is growing about Jesus the Jew, that it to me scrambles some of the categories from the past. I've been doing a lot of work since I last saw you in sort of the 2nd to 5th century work of the philosophers and theologians who tried to define Christianity as best they could. And one of the things that's notable to me is an omission. They never deal with the Jewishness of Jesus. That's been an inconvenient fact in our tradition, for both of our traditions, I think, for a long time. And so I would put that on the agenda, of things that we need to discuss together. I think that is prime among them. And I would recommend to all who are on this Zoom call that the book by Barbara Meyer, who is called Jesus the Jew in Christian Memory, is one that I think really leads to a great deal of reflection. Barbara Meyer is a systematic theologian, trained with the best of them in Germany. She has lived and worked, taught in Israel for many, many years, and is a associate professor at Tel Aviv University in the religion department. So I recommend this as a very stimulating reflection that both of our communities would benefit from. Similarly, Eugene, particularly today, you raised to the forefront the category of idolatry. Now, in the book, you're talking about it primarily with in the Middle Ages, where the rabbis are trying to figure out whether we Christians, we Gentiles, whether it's really avodah zarah or what are we? And we're not practicing idolatry. I think it would be very stimulating to have a session on what do we consider idolatry today? And I think we would find a lot of common ground. And it wouldn't have to do with statues and certain, I mean, it could be, if you think an inanimate object is divine, I probably have some some issues with that myself. So I would say, and here's one thing that I think is an issue to discuss, and that is you're trying to navigate the way that Jews think about Christianity, but your default position is pretty much always Catholic theology. And that conflation doesn't really quite work if you want to talk, then it's impossible to really, Christianity is such a large and heterogeneous perspective. I speak as a Catholic who's taught now for 30 years at the ecumenical and now interreligious Union Theological Seminary. And, I get a headache just thinking about this question. So poor Jews, but one of the things that I do think that might make for stimulating conversation specifically would be, is Christian nationalism idolatrous? And I say this because you discuss in your book the way in which, at least in terms of Catholic Christianity, Jews need no longer, in a sense, be fearful of a press to convert. That this is not something that's any longer. It's actually not been for quite some time that there's been an emphasis on trying to convert the other, including Jews. But especially in recent years. But what I fear in the United States anyway, and usually things get exported, is the way in which Christian nationalists clearly exclude Jews from the full participation in civic life, and in which there's a tremendous naivete theologically on the part of Christian nationalism. But it is a huge movement, and it is very, in my mind, I'm answering my own question. Yes, I think it is idolatrous. So one of the things that you just raised about supersessionism, I wish it were true that Vatican II renounced supersessionism. I think what it did is that it launched and, in a sense, validated theological thinking that leads to the renunciation of supersessionism. At the level of how average Catholic Christians, I'm most familiar with that because I'm a practicing Catholic, I'm not just a theologian reading books. I still think it's around, and in many ways, our liturgical year, especially the way that the lectionary is set up with the first and third Sunday readings, it is supersessionist, and it takes preaching that's going to recognize that problem and counter that. So what Vatican II did was set things in process. And here we are nearly 60 years later, sort of shocking for those of us who have a memory of this, though of course very, very distant, that it's taking so long for this to permeate the church at the parish level, the average level. That being said, and trying to ameliorate what I just claimed, that supersessionism has not breathed its last breath, I would also say that there is a general awareness, even if people couldn't footnote Nostra Aetate or any subsequent document, that the attitude of Catholicism today is very different in its understanding of Jews and Judaism than it was in a previous era. I don't know how much people could go beyond that in terms of specifics. I think that's also true, at least in my experience on the ecumenical front, in at least portions of the Episcopal Church of the United States, and to a certain extent in the Anglican Communion worldwide, at least in the West. Certainly the Lutherans have done a great deal to try to deal with the heritage of Martin Luther and and of that time. So I guess my quibble is to realize that, in a sense, to say, well, I'm going to talk primarily about Catholic Christianity because it's easier to document. There are teachings and there is a trajectory of the development of teachings. So how we talk about ourselves, in relationship to the word, the meaning of salvation, I think it's another great topic. And how we've moved from this notion, we meaning many Christians, the notion of salvation as my getting to heaven by being good, to this notion of salvation being a part of what it means to participate in God's justice in the world, and that salvation is a social reality, not simply something that's between me and my God. And that's something that I think is much more natural to Jewish thought than it is to Christianity. Anyway, those are a few things, sort of an initial response. And so maybe you want to push back a bit, as you usually do, but also some areas of agreement. And thank you very much for your work. It's been very stimulating to read, and I'm only raising just a few points that I think might be of general interest to people.
Yes, okay, so I'll be brief so we can handle some questions from the other people who are on. But just a couple notes. You covered a wide area here, Mary. Just, you recommended Barbara Meyer's book about understanding Jesus as a Jew, which is a very important book. It's a very important book to read. I know Barbara. She lives in Tel Aviv. I've taught some of her classes at Tel Aviv University, but I'm an Orthodox Jew, so we always have a preference for people who are in the past than people who are in the present. So there was a great Jewish scholar named David Flusser,
Yes,
who was a great scholar of the Gospels.
the parables.
He was a classicist. He read the Gospels in the original Greek, and he wrote a number of books about Jesus the Jew. And he pointed out something that you alluded to. He traced every statement of Jesus in the New Testament, and he said that 76 or 77% of them were straight out of rabbinic Pharisaic tradition. So if you for people who want to further investigate Jesus as a Jew, as a learned Jew, as a Pharisaic Jew, David Flusser's books are really excellent also. About Christian nationalism, yeah, I agree with you. It's a major problem, and I don't know as enough about Christian nationalism to say it's idolatry. But my problem here in Jerusalem is some dimensions of Jewish nationalism.
Oh, yes.
I have another book. I'm a Jewish nationalist. I'm a Zionist. I believe that Jews have a right to have their own sovereign state in the biblical homeland. So I'm a Jewish nationalist. But some Jewish nationalists are idolaters because they worship the land and they disregard every other aspect of Jewish theology and biblical tradition. So, and that's not a theoretical problem. That's a real problem that causes pain. Sometimes it causes death, and it certainly causes injustice. So you're right. Any form of nationalism that's taken to an extreme that ignores, the moral dimensions of our faith commitments and the moral dimensions of the biblical covenant, is extremely, extremely dangerous. Now, let me just point out that, of course, Christians don't see themselves as Noahites, right? That's an exclusively Jewish theological approach. what I tried to point out in the book is that Jews have to come out of their own theological ghetto and begin to understand, while using Jewish categories, begin to understand Christians as they understand themselves, not as Noahites, but in terms of traditional Jewish terms, we should have no theological obstacle to seeing Christians as co-members of the Abrahamic covenant. And that's something that I think, that's very fertile ground, and there's a lot to talk about. It's not without its problems, it's not without its constraints, but that's a whole new way of looking at Christians for traditional Jews. And again, I think now's a right time to do it, because the old threat of Christian motives to convert Jews, at least Catholic motives to convert Jews, well, it still may be a theoretical ideal. It's not a real practical problem today. So we can deal with it. We can discuss these things as equals and not as, the biblical fraternal toxic relationship between Esau and Jacob, which was the paradigm in the Middle Age, and still is a paradigm for many traditional Jews. I think it's simply wholly inapplicable today. So what I'm calling for is more theological dialogue, more understanding, because there are real issues that need to be straightened out. And even if it means being able to more precisely define where we differ, I think that's an important, almost therapeutic exercise that we need to go through. But there's a lot that if we know more about each other, there's a lot that we can discover, that we can be partners, because there's so much to agree on. So that's just some of the points that you raised. Maybe next time when we're in New York, we can go to lunch and talk more fully about the other points you raised.
And let's hope it won't be in relationship to a crisis like when we used to go around with the Mel Gibson film, The Passion of the Christ, and met with some considerable resistance.
I would just mention, I can't resist the temptation, to make one more point that you once raised when we had lunch together at the Jewish Theological Seminar. You once said to me that you want to see that Christians should see themselves as also standing at Sinai. I remember you made that point, and that's why and I thought a lot about that. So in a certain sense, Mary, you were very influential in my writing the book, because I thought a lot about things that you said to me over the years. And that's a point at which I think Jews could never agree with Christians on. But we can agree about, that we're both partners in the Abrahamic covenant. But the Mosaic covenant, I think that's something that Jews are not prepared to share, and I'm not sure they should be prepared to share.
Well, first of all, I did say this to you, kind of tongue in cheek might be the wrong. I've never written it, so I've never thought systematically about that. But then when I thought about the passage with Jesus and the scribe, what I think I might have said to you, God knows, I forget what I said 2 minutes ago, let alone what I said to you many years ago, but something like, we're way in the background there. But, our liturgy in many ways is based on the paradigm of the Exodus. And now how that's traditionally been read is that your Passover was in the past and ours is now, and so on. But if you do away with that paradigm, what happens between God and Moses? Jesus, the Jew, is a part of that, and if we come to Sinai, we come somehow through Jesus, but it's not to say we are in the covenant instead, ours is the covenant, not yours, but that we recognize that you are the recipients of the Mosaic covenant, and somehow through Jesus, we see ourselves mirrored. I don't want to push this farther than it is, but I can't really think of myself as in covenant without somehow seeing the Jesus, the Jew, as a part of that. And one of the problems, it's pretty common now, I think, at least in many theologies of, the kind of the major Protestant denominations and Catholics and so forth. And I don't know to what extent in the Eastern Orthodox churches, not to say that Jesus is a Jew, but it doesn't really grab people as it should. It doesn't have enough content. And that's one of the things I think Barbara Meyer is trying to ask us to consider. But one of them might be just sort of a renewed importance of covenant, of seeing ourselves that, what it says, in the 2015 document from the Vatican on the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, citing Paul, that Jesus is the living Torah of God. Now, in typical Vatican fashion, they make this proclamation, but it doesn't really develop it. But if we were to believe, first of all of that teaching of Christianity saying the law is old, the law is legalistic, Jesus gives us the law of love, that contrast has to go out the window. So it's an affirmation of Torah, but how we see ourselves as recipients in some way of aspects of Torah through Jesus is, it's an unexplored thing, I think, in many, many respects. So, I think we're kind of on a, new page, and of course, what Jesus taught has echoes in rabbinic teaching, but of course, the rabbinic teachings are put to writing later, so, but of course, insofar as you're talking about something like common Judaism, Jesus shares in that. So anyway, so it's a very stimulating book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to both of you for raising some really, really interesting questions and topics here for discussion. So we'll see what we could possibly get to in the Q&A. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to take a very quick stretch break, maybe just 2 minutes if you've got to refill your coffee or what have you, and then we'll come back for Q&A. And if some of you have questions and would like to begin putting them in the chat, you can do that while we're on the break. And of course, we'll also take questions live from folks using the raised hand feature. Okay, so I've got 2 o'clock on my time, so we'll be back at 2:02. Okay, so we're just at the end of our break time, so we can get back to some questions. And again, if anyone would like to ask a question live, please use the raised hand feature, or otherwise you can put your questions in the chat. And I'll handle the live questions, and Benny, you can keep an eye on the chat there. But maybe to get things going, Benny, did you have any questions or anything you wanted to raise?
So first of all, thank you for the fascinating conversation. I wanted to ask Rabbi Korn. You talked about the importance of clarifying where we differ. So realistically speaking, do you think that Jews could ever categorize Christians as more than Noahites or followers of the Noahide covenant? Or would this contradict the general principle that you mentioned, that is important to clarify where we differ? For example, would it be possible for Judaism to conceive of Christianity in the way that Nathan al-Fayoumi, the famous 12th century Yemenite rabbi, conceived of Islam? Just to summarize, Fayoumi argued that God sends prophets to establish religions for other nations, non-Jewish nations, which do not conform to the precepts of the Torah, just explicitly referring to Muhammad as a true prophet and therefore of Islam as a legitimate message for the Arabs. Would this be something that be conceivable for Christianity? Or again, would this contradict the principle of clarifying where we differ because of the ways in which Judaism conceives of the Trinity, incarnation, and so on?
Yes, thank you, Benny. The answer is yes and yes. Yes, Jews can, and I think they ought to, being fully traditional in the sense of being consistent with rabbinic sources. We can and should see Christians as more than Noahites, both historically and theologically, because look, we have the Jewish people have and Jewish biblical and rabbinic theology have a different relationship with Christians than we do with Buddhists, right? Buddhists are also probably Noahites. But there's a much closer connection between, and Mary brought this out, I think, very well, a much closer connection, both in terms of sources, in terms of texts, in terms of ideas, between Jews and Christian than between Jews and other religions. Now, Islam, maybe not, because it's something very interesting that theologically, Jews are much closer to Islam than they are to Christianity, because Islam also requires pure absolute monotheism. That in Jewish terms, Christianity does not fulfill. Our major theological difference with Christianity is not so much the Trinity, it's the incarnation. That's something that no Jew can admit and still be faithful to Jewish tradition. Okay, so that's a hard difference that we have. But again, you know, the medieval rabbis also began to understand in a very bold move, right, that our Torah doesn't require of Gentiles that they be absolute monotheists. Okay, so if the rabbis in the Middle Ages could do that, why can't we in the 21st century do that? And the impediments are, I think, more historical and cultural than they are theological. So yes, we can see, we can and should begin to see Christians as more than simple Noahites. That thesis doesn't explain the hard data. I mean, for whatever reason, God has thrown Jews and Christians together for 2,000 years. Oh, yeah, it's just about 2,000 years now, in a way that hasn't happened with Hindus and Buddhists and even with Muslims. Okay, so we have to think about this and find a way to be faithful to the sources, be faithful to our traditions, and yet build a better future together.
Thank you.
By the way, Benny, in Kabbalah has this, and Chassidut, have a phrase that God has many messengers. God sends many messengers. That's very traditional Judaism. So maybe one of the messengers was Jesus. I mean, he's not divine to us, but he could be a faithful messenger. And why not? As long as Christianity doesn't pose an existential and theological threat to us.
Sister Dr. Boyce, would you like to add anything to this?
Well, I think one of the challenges of our time is the recognition that our categories about the other are so inadequate. And, what if we begin with the premise that the God who is beyond all names loves difference, and that difference does not preclude disagreement, but it doesn't mean heresy or infidelity. So, so I think that this is one of the forefronts of the Christian theological thinking today, is how we try to understand the other in terms of the other's self-understanding. And for at least for Catholic Christians, given some of the documentation, some of the reflection, theological reflection, in a sense, our relationship with Judaism here is paradigmatic, because we have traditionally imposed our categories of what Judaism is on Jews. But, one of the things is that traditions are very broad and deep and complicated. So, like one of the questions that's in the chat now has to do with, it's not Jewish tradition to turn the other cheek. Well, tradition's a complicated kind of word. So what was Jesus saying in the context of first century Jewish life? We don't know exact. I mean, people talk today about Jesus as a Torah observant Jew. I think of Jesus that way as well, but we don't really know what Torah observance constituted at the time of Second Temple Judaism. There was no definitive rabbinic authority, so as yet. So it seems to me that the tradition, there might be sort of the main lines of the tradition, but there's also the variations. And if you go into the first century, you have how certain Jews thought. You have the Pharisaic school, Sadducean, but we don't really know exactly what the Pharisees and the Sadducees taught, because we can't be sure of what texts come from them. But we do know what the Covenanters at Qumran thought about certain things. But that can't be normative, because we know these other schools of thought exist. So we have to be willing to complicate our traditions and to realize they change and evolve over time.
Thank you.
Okay, I see we have
Arthur, you want to take one question from the...
Yeah, so I see Richard has his hand up. So Richard, please, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Eugene, for writing such an ironic and challenging book. And thank you to Mary Boyce for your comments. I want to pick up on what Mary Boyce says, that what we need today is to seek to understand each other as we understand ourselves. And I'm happy that Rabbi Korn has connected us Christians with the Abrahamic covenant. And I agree certainly with that, but I would like to push it a little further, because Christians see themselves as in covenant with Jesus. And my favorite quote is from 2 Corinthians, where Paul says, "It is not I who live, but Christ who lives in me." And I would like to suggest, as the late Pope John Paul II said, that there are not two covenants, as it were, on two railroad tracks, as some have argued, including John Pelikowski, that one track is the Sinai covenant going to God, and the other track is the covenant in Jesus going to God. But rather, there's only one track, and we're both part of that same track of Sinai, and that Christians are part of that track through Jesus the Jew. It's an ironic and rather bizarre image if you try to diagram it, but we Christians are all identified into Jesus, who is a member of the covenant, who never ceased becoming a Jew, who lived, taught, and died as a Jew. And it's only later Christians in the 4th century that we talked about him being an incarnation. And I think an ironic way for us as Christians is to think of it, as Mary Boyce has mentioned too, that Jesus is the incarnate Torah, that he's the incarnation of word and instruction, of Yod He Vav He, and that I wonder how Rabbi Korn would react to this, that we're both members of the covenant, but it's a covenant with two different modalities. The modality of covenant life for Jews, is through Hillel and through Gemara and Mishnah and the Torah and Maimonides and Rabbi Abraham Herschel and David Hartman and all modern teachers. But the modality of covenant life for Christians is the Christian theologizing the Christian life, the sacramental life, the power of the word in our liturgy, and that's how we live. And only one footnote, if people want to really understand how Jesus, the Jew, taught as a Jew, they should read some of the books by Amy Jo Levine, including the one of Jesus Stories, the parables that Jesus taught, which is a wonderful, enlightening way to understand Jesus in the Second Temple context. And with that, I'll be quiet.
Okay, so Richard, I think you were addressing some of your remarks to me.
Yes.
I would say on the first point about understanding ourselves or understand the other as they understand themselves, we need to do a much better job with that. And I think, you know, that's one of the great points that was made. I think it was in the Vatican document guidelines. It says there that Christians need to strive to understand Jews as Jews understand themselves. And that goes both ways. You know, I'll tell you, I studied with a great rabbi in Jerusalem named David Hartman many years ago. So David was an Orthodox Jew, and he went to study philosophy at Fordham with the Jesuits. So, and he came from a kind of cloistered, you know, monolithically Jewish background. And the first class, he struck up a discussion with a nun, you know, and they enjoyed meeting each other and talking with each other. So he came to the second class, and the nun said, Rabbi Hartman, I so enjoyed speaking to you the other day. I went home and I told my mother that I met a Pharisee today, you know, because for her, a Jew was a theological or a literary category. It wasn't a real human being, you know, and it was a complete misconception of what Jews are today. And Jews have the same problem with Christians, most Jews, right? We are clueless about who Christians really are, particularly believing Christians, like Mary and like you know, and too many Jews still think of Christians as medieval crusaders who either want to convert or kill or convert Jews. And we need to really get real and understand each other, not only in terms of why it's philosophically and theologically important, but I think it's strategically and practically very important, because we have common threats, we have common enemies, and we need to work together to survive. You know, Jews somehow, too many traditional Jews think that the world should leave us alone. We should be in a ghetto. We shouldn't try to make friends. Well, the Shoah showed what happened to the Jewish people when they had no allies and when they had no friends. So I think it's dangerous and strategically a huge mistake, you know, to hold that attitude. On the second point, Richard, I disagree with you. I don't think that Jews can see Christians and Jews on the same track or in the same covenant. You know, for us, you know, the covenant means observing the Sabbath on the seventh day. That's a serious part of the covenant. Christians do not do that. And I'm not criticizing Christians, but they can't claim to be in that covenant at the same covenant as Jews, when for us, the covenant means celebrating the Sabbath as a symbol that God created the world and rested on the seventh day. There's a completely different conception in Christian theology about the Sabbath, which is on the first day. So it's very, very hard for Jews to understand how Christians, you know, could be in that same covenant. We may have two tracks. We should have two tracks. That's fine. You know, we don't have to be enemies of each other. As Mary says, God has enough blessings for both of us. Okay. But I can't understand how Jews could ever make that claim that Christians are in the same Sinaitic covenant. But we don't have a problem with that because we have a certain amount of limited theological pluralism that's okay for us. I don't know if it's as easy for Christians to say that.
Yeah, it's not as easy for Christians because we see ourselves far more intimately with, as Mary Boyce also says, the Exodus is a paradigm, and in some sense how we also stand at Sinai, but with Jesus. And I think that's one of the biggest theological challenges in the future, because we see ourselves far more than you're able to see us.
Right. It's okay. I mean, it's okay for us to disagree.
Okay.
Well, and I think here history is the great problem. I mean, I understand why, question in chat here about, given the history, why should Jews try to understand Christianity as a good thing or see Christians in a good light? Well, I understand that, but could we not also premise that many Christians have a radically different perspective than from an earlier time? And even even in the worst of the history, there were Christians who didn't fall for the really heretical teachings of the church at times. I would even say. So earlier this month, or actually end of June, I was in Salzburg, Austria, for the International Council of Christians and Jews, and I think for Jews to understand that we can come together in our common commitment to dialogue, and that we learn that we can disagree theologically, but we have a common commitment to the world, to humankind. And I think here I return to your 6 points about covenantal partnership, Eugene, that even the sixth one about what messianic faith, belief in human progress, the commitment to making progress. Sometimes I wonder how far we've actually come. We've only made the weapons of war more toxic and dangerous than our earlier primitive ancestors. But the repair of the world, tikkun olam, that may be a Hebrew phrase, but it is something we can all be committed to and should be committed to. And the notion that salvation has to do with longing for and working toward God's justice and mercy being palpable in the world in ways that it's not now. And it seems that we also can model to other human beings and other religious traditions that you can disagree and be partners.
I'd like to ask maybe one last question from the audience, from Marie Watson to both of you. Let's put it that way. I'm reading, obviously people like Flosser, Vermes, etc. were of an earlier generation who laid the essential foundations for so much of what we are talking about today. What is your sense of how interested a younger generation, those under 35, is in this sort of dialogue, which is largely online, social media and all that, and might be transforming their attitudes towards Christians or Christians toward Jews? So sociological question about the younger generation and the continuation of this dialogue.
Well, I think, if you're talking about North America, North America is a very fast train going to a secular destination. In other words, even though I guess demographically, the United States and Canada are still officially Christian countries, the powerful secular culture there is overwhelming. And the generation under 35 are largely, too many of them are just not interested in religion or in theology or in fundamental faith commitments. So it's hard for me to assess how interested they are in that. I mean, one of the sad parts is that if you look at people who are doing Christian-Jewish dialogue, for the most part, they're 50 and over. We grew up in the heady days of the 1960s with the Second Vatican Council and the Copernican Revolution and Christian teachings about Jews. The younger generation, it's not that they're anti-Christian or anti-Jewish, they're interested in secular things. And in this sense, I would go back to the point that I made earlier, that one of the reasons we should be allies is that we are both fighting against this enormously powerful secular culture which teaches almost exclusively materialism and physicalism, and that there's no spiritual dimension the to life today. You know, I was once at Yeshiva University when there was a whole retinue of Catholic cardinals who came. I think there were maybe 25 to 30 of them. They came to Yeshiva University to talk to the people at Yeshiva University, the Orthodox Jewish institution. Why did they come? Because they understood that both Orthodox Jews and believing Christians are fighting the same battle against the ravages of secular culture. And so this is something that we have in common. And I think, sadly, we're losing too many of the younger generation, those people who are under 35 in North America.
Perhaps, Eugene, you implied that we are over 50?
Well,
okay, a year or two.
50 sounds very good to me, Mary.
Yeah, it does. It's looking better and better. Thanks, Mary, for your question. It's true. I mean, around the corner, there's more gray hair than not. I will say in Salzburg at the International Council of Christians and Jews, there's a concerted effort to honor young leadership and to give them real responsibilities and prominence. And I think we were all really touched by that and given hope by that. I think there's no question that many young people feel betrayed by the church and disinterested and so forth. And yet, when I look around where you have a vital church, I happen right now to belong to a very vital parish community. I mean, there are young people there, and they are, you know, very active participants. So I think this is the problem. Too many churches are dead men, led by dead men walking. And so I think when there's vitality and joy in a religious community, that's the best counter to secularism. So that being said, I think we need, I mean, you know, I teach at a school where Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel gave one of his best known lectures in 1965 on No Religion is an Island, in which he says religious pluralism is the will of God. And I don't know how many people were saying that in 1965, let alone in 2024. But if you believe that, and we live it, and that one of the things, Eugene, that I most appreciate in your book, speaking of Heschel, you quote Heschel saying that the first requisite or the prerequisite for interfaith is faith, and you affirm that, and you say, but there are two other necessities for that, and the first is, or you know, in other words, the second. So first faith, then secondly, to be religiously knowledgeable. And I think this is the thing that worries me a great deal. For the most part, there's just not that commitment to education within our traditions. And I mean, it's amazing to me, even people who come from Protestant church traditions don't know anything about the Bible, which is, it still shocks me. But the third thing you say is spiritual integrity. And would you just say a word about what that term means to you? Because it certainly resonates with me, but I think it's something worth developing briefly.
You know, I think it means a real commitment to spiritual values and a willingness to say so publicly. There was a motto at the beginning of the Enlightenment and the Jewish emancipation in Europe, that you should be a human being on the street and a Jew in your home. In other words, you could be Jewish, you could be a believing Jew, but don't put it out in the public arena. Don't put it out, in the public space. Religion is a private affair. So what I was trying to say in many different ways in the book is that we have to be confident in our beliefs and our spiritual values, and we should not be afraid to articulate them in the public arena. And we also have to be very spiritually honest and consistent. Too many religious leaders kind of make compromises for political reasons, or for communal reasons, or for sometimes materialistic reasons. That's not integrity, that's the lack of integrity. So we have to have confidence to assert what we believe, and to be honest, and to not to make compromises on our essential beliefs.
Amen.
Okay, well, thank you both. It looks like we're just at 2:30, so it's time to wrap it up. Time flies when you're having fun. Thanks to both of you for really stimulating conversation. We really just scratched the surface in terms of some really, really big questions and issues, the conversations that we'll all continue to have. So Rabbi Korn, thank you for writing this book. I would encourage any of you who are interested in learning more about Rabbi Korn's work and sort of views on this topic, please go ahead and get yourself a copy of the book. And Professor Boyce, thank you for your perspective. And really another aspect of this back and forth is really the friendship that you two have, which is also, apart from the ideas and the history and all of that, a really, really important aspect of dialogue, something that I think people often overlook, but is very, very important. And thank you all who joined us today. The recording will be posted on our website shortly. And if you'd like to visit our website, go to jewish-catholic.providence.edu. If you'd like to be added to our email list for future events, you can send an email to jcte@providence.edu. So from us here in Providence, we wish all of you a good day, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. God bless you.
God bless.
Thank you.